need people to what are the things, thank you for turning that on, Dax. I forgot to do that as well. What are the things that people encounter that lead them to believe that PDF files are not accessible? Well, one of the big things is the reading order of the document. Okay, accessible assistive technologies, they read the content of the file in the order that that content has been tagged. And if that content is not tagged correctly, it can be a very unfortunate experience, because imagine if you took a magazine page and just shuffled everything around. That is the experience if the reading order is not properly set. So that's a big one, and that's certainly something to keep in mind. Tables are another one, and this one is not a problem with the PDF format in and of itself, because to be fair, the PDF format allows us to do things with tables that many other software cannot, right? Like Word, for example, natively is very limited in how it can interpret tables. But in a PDF file, it's okay if you have merged rows. It's okay if you have multiple header rows. It can be made accessible. And then, of course, alternative text, okay? Every figure in your document should have alternative text whose job is to describe what is happening in that image. And that's really important, because a figure in a PDF file, or a figure in a Word document for that matter, has no inherent value. So all a user is going to know is that it is, of course, a figure. But beyond that, there is nothing there for them to read. So that's where alternative text comes into play. Pain point number 2, and this is a big one. And all of the tools that we use are offenders, but that is that the tools we use are flawed, okay? Whether it's Word, whether it's PowerPoint, whether it's Adobe InDesign. Trust me, guys, you guys know I'm an InDesign lover, but even InDesign falls short, okay? So the tools that we use have flaws that we need to overcome. And remediating the file in Acrobat is not always, it's not the ideal solution. We want to do as much as we can in the source before we get to Acrobat. The other thing we hear all the time, accessibility is too hard. Accessibility is not too hard. You just need to chew accessibility in small bites. Maybe is that a good analogy? Is that a good way to put it?
I hear you there. I had a science teacher who used to say, anything unknown seems impossible. And it basically was, if you don't know about something, it always seems impossible. Right? Magic. If you don't know how a magic trick is done, you're like, yep, how did he do that? But the reality is it's often a very simple, simple thing. Now, that's not to say all remediation is simple and there's no reason that anybody can do it. It's just that the majority of accessibility is really about how to create accessible source content, or the correct source content. And then, of course, the combination of the flaws and overcoming the flaws within the tools, right?
Right. And one of the things that you're going to hear Dax and I kind of preach, over and over again, is you want to do as much as you can in the source document to facilitate this process. The worst approach is print the PDF and we'll make it work in Acrobat. That is the hard way, the time-consuming way, the expensive way, right? And we don't want you to do things that way. We want you to do things easier. And, when it comes to accessibility, Dax and I also, you'll hear us say this quite often, some accessibility is better than no accessibility, right?
Yep,
and so,
absolutely.
You know what I mean? Like if you do absolutely nothing, the document is not going to be accessible at all. But small improvements, small changes to how you work is going to make a very big difference. Okay. So the other pain point we have is I don't have time for training or fixing, right? And listen, I mean, I've been a trainer for 30 years. I can't believe I'm that old. But I've been a trainer for 30 years and I've heard this over and over again. We don't have time to learn something new, or we don't have time to be away from production or from our jobs to learn these skills. And, we're not talking about days of training. We're talking about an hour, 2 hours can make a significant difference in your workflow and facilitate the creation of an accessible PDF file.
Hey, Chad, do you have this? What's that saying that you always say about you never have time to do it right, but what is that? What's that saying?
Yeah. So like I come from the print production world, and we had a saying, there's never time to do it right, but there's always time to do it over.
Right.
And it's so true. It's so true. Like if a job got messed up and it totally went to pot, there was always time to redo it, but there was never time to take the time to do it right in the first time, right?
Well,
The first time.
And it goes back to the idea that I would say 80% of accessibility is about using the tools the way they were intended, right? And I know that as teachers and people in higher education, where we have so many hats that we're wearing, there's so many different things that we're doing. We've learned what we've learned, and this is the way we do it, and that's just the way it is. But the reality is, oftentimes, the program is designed to create content accessibly if we just use the tools the way they were intended. So just like Chad said, a few hours or an hour of accessibility training can significantly take your documents from 20% accessibility to 80%. And if you could produce, I said this earlier today, if you could produce a document consistently that was 80% accessible, wouldn't the world be a better place? It doesn't have to be perfect.
It absolutely would. It would have a significant improvement. Pain point number 5, different information from different streams and sources, right? So we've listed a couple of them here. You can see that we've got, Word, PDF, PowerPoint, InDesign. And to be fair, right, I mean, when it comes to source documents, really what we have to work with is Word, PowerPoint, and InDesign. Those are the applications, and again, they're flawed. Don't get me wrong, but at the very least, they have implemented accessibility into the document to facilitate the creation of an accessible PDF file. One of the things you guys always want to avoid, never print to a PDF file. And I know that's hard for some of us who have been in the design industry for a long time. That used to be the way we created PDF files. You just print the PDF and now you have a PDF file. When you use that method, you get no accessibility whatsoever, 0. So the key is to use the source application appropriately, right? Whether it's Word, whether it's PowerPoint, whether it's InDesign, use the features built into those programs, and you will get a significant improvement in the accessibility of those PDF files, bar none.
Well, and one of the things to remember is that when you copy and paste, we all do it. We all get our sources from, it's very seldom that you're starting from a blank document and you just sit down and start to write. And so you're always copying and pasting from somewhere. And remember that the source that you copy from is so important because there's all this underlying data inside these documents that are, I mean, if you think about it, you may not have known this, but a Word document is literally a zip file. If you take the Word doc and change the extension from docx to zip and then unpack it, you'll see that it's just a series of images and support code that creates this Word doc, right? And there's all this inherent metadata behind stuff. So that's why when you paste stuff into Word or PowerPoint or InDesign, sometimes it doesn't look like how it looked like in the source document because all of that gets kind of scrambled. So, there's a couple of different ways to kind of clean or scrub that, right, Chad?
Absolutely, absolutely. But you know what? I wanted to pause for a second because I'm monitoring the chat, and Carolyn Quintero had a really good question. She said, "Are they ever going to fix that? You know, the limitations of the source documents. Are they ever going to fix that? It seems like a huge flaw." And you're right, Carolyn. The problem is Dax and I have been waiting for years, right? We have been waiting for years to see the software improve, and it hasn't happened. And I'm going to be quite honest with you. Dax and I have leveraged third party tools to overcome those limitations. It's just, I know what you're saying because Microsoft, Adobe, they're giant companies. They've got so much resources available to them. The reality is we're just not seeing any movement. We're not seeing the improvements that we need. So
I mean,
Dax and I really leverage the third party products.
being able to export an image or a smart art with the correct alt text seems like a pretty basic thing, right? I mean, you should be able to set the alt text, then save a document out and have that alt text appear in the PDF. And yet still programs as a basic level cannot accomplish that. And I'm still just blown away that we have to use third-party tools. Now, Chad and I use a tool called Access Word, which is a plugin for Word that allows you to use some styles and then a bunch of other tools to overcome things like layout tables and extra hard returns and split bullet lists and all sorts of stuff, because the tool understands a limitation of Word and allows it to overcome. So if you're interested in that, feel free to reach out to us after the show. So, how did we get here, right? How did we get to this point that we are, millions of documents on the web, all PDFs, most of them are inaccessible. And here we are as educators trying to juggle all these different hats and to be able to do our job while trying to conform to the web content accessibility guidelines. It's a struggle, right? Right. So we have to assume a few different things, right? People assume that we're just expected to know how to use Word or Excel or PowerPoint or even Google Docs, right? That you just know how to do it. Most people don't take classes on how to use Word or PowerPoint properly, or even Excel, right? Well, maybe Excel because it's a lot of formulaic stuff. But, when you're talking about the expectations of understanding the software, we just kind of jump in and start doing it. And when you already have these built-in flaws because you've been doing it the same way forever, using a table to lay out your columns, it's really hard to adapt to change when you're trying to create documents now with this new requirement of being accessible. And you don't know what you don't know, right? You don't know, hey, that a layout table is a bad thing, or that you should always have content in the very first cell of your table, that A1 cell, right? If you don't know, you don't know. And then you get the accessibility error and you're like, well, why am I getting this error? And what am I supposed to do about it, right? And then Chad talked about the print to PDF and the idea that when we print to PDF the way we always do, that we end up with a PDF that is inaccessible. And we're like, oh, no problem. I'll just use auto tag. And then, well, if you've ever used auto tag, I don't know how much more I can say about that. And then actually Autumn brings up a very good point. Even when you tell others about the tools, they still don't use them. Change is definitely hard for certain people. It is really hard to implement. But if you can show them the barriers of doing it the way that they've always done it versus the accessibility of doing it a different way, then oftentimes you'll see that paramount shift. You'll see that sentiment move over, right? And of course, I already have a mountain of work to do. I have no time to learn. I need to balance my students' needs over creating these accessible documents. And of course, I'll just do it at the end. I'll create my document and I'll just, do the accessibility at the end. And we all know that accessibility at the end is the hardest and the most difficult to implement, which is why we get the sentiment that accessibility is hard and it's just too complicated. And, if you just used styles and added alt text to your images, you'd be like 90% there. And But again, we don't know what we don't know. And then there are workflow bottlenecks, right? There are always last minute changes, and maybe our system's outdated because we're using some proprietary system of posting our content, or maybe you have an IT department that all your documents have to get run through. And so you end up with an overworked, understaffed IT department that says, we'll get to that on Wednesday. And you're like, my class is in an hour. And so, it's really hard to try to make that all happen when you have those bottlenecks. And so what do? Most of the time, you're like, I'll get it next time. I'll make it accessible if someone asks for it, right?
Yeah.
But we know that that's always, what is more of a time suck than when you've done something 2 weeks ago and then somebody comes back and says, hey, I need these 8 documents and they all need to be accessible. And you're like, okay, let me drop everything I'm doing and make these 8 documents accessible, right? Exactly, Autumn. Being proactive rather than reactive is definitely the way to go. And Carolyn Quintero says, organizational budgets for third-party tools to improve workflow. That's a big pain point for us. Now, here's the problem, though. If you, or something to think about, if you were to take the amount of time over the course of a month or a few months and record how much time, or even estimate how much time you spend fixing documents, going through and redoing things, or just learning about what it is to do something, to make it accessible, you would find that almost always the $60 a month or $100 a month that you might spend for a tool is far less than the 8 hours or 10 hours you spent trying to make these 20 documents accessible. So, and we can help you do that. We can help you do a workflow evaluation if that's something you want to do, right?
And Jen just said that, Dax. Jen just said that's how she was able to get it approved, by tracking the time it took. And I would encourage you guys, do an ROI. Do an ROI on this. Just track your time for a week and see how much time you're spending in Acrobat cleaning up those files. And I'll tell you what, at any point in time, Dax and I'd be happy to give you a demo. But like when you save a PDF out of Word and it's 100% compliant right out of the chute, it's a really easy sell. You know what I mean? And, when you say, oh my gosh, I don't have to clean it up. I mean, it's amazing. So just something to keep in mind.
And one of the other things I think about is, this morning I was remediating. It was one of the handouts that you guys should download, and all I did was click on one button to make the PDF UA icon, one button to set all of the alt text for all the links, one button to fix all the placement attribute issues. I literally went click, 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 and in that amount of time, that easily, I saved myself 30 minutes worth of time had I had to go through and set each one of those things individually. They weren't hard things. They just take time, right? And that goes to my next point, is that the support. Usually in your organization, there are no accessibility experts. You're left to kind of fend for yourself, to figure it out on your own. You might have fragmented information or past, checklists or PDF guides that somebody made. And I will tell you, I look at almost all those on the web, and many of them contain seriously outdated information or even flat out bad practices for accessibility. So it's kind of a crapshoot on what you get, right? And that goes to the next thing, preferences versus compliance. An agency may say, you must have 12-point font for everything that you do. Okay, well, that's a preference. And that's not a bad preference, but it's a preference. It is not compliance. And understanding the nuances between those two things is definitely something that not everyone is versed in. And of course, not having a group of peers. Usually you're in small teams. Could I give me a exclamation point if you are in a team of less than 5 people in the chat right now? Throw up a question, an exclamation point in the chat. If you see, almost everyone is small teams. And so who do you go to when you have a question? How do you find the answer? right? Most of us are just teams of 2 or 3 people, sometimes teams of 1 person trying to figure it out, and you have no peers to go to. Well, this is a little bit of a shameless plug for our PDF accessibility group. And while the screen says PDF accessibility 2,200 members, I will tell you currently we have more than 2,500, almost 2,600 members in our PDF accessibility Facebook group, and we're always there. Andrea says, private message Dax. Well, I don't know if everybody can do that. Maybe private message Chad, right? But you can always post content there. And people are answering questions in minutes, and it is so great to see that group growing and blossoming, right? And of course, the final thing is that there are no defined processes for creation. This is a big frustration, and it's why we included the checklist in today's handouts. It wasn't part of what we announced, but I wanted to give you the Microsoft Word accessibility checklist, which is not the accessibility checker inside Word, which is a great place to start. But this checklist is a 2-page comprehensive checklist that will really help you kind of dial in your document. The other thing is there's no walkthroughs, no style guidelines, right? And Chad and I worked with the World Bank and with NORC and a couple of other different organizations, University of Chicago, to define an accessibility best practices manual for them. This manual was more than 60 pages full of checklists and standards and walkthroughs and all of this important information that they could use as a growing living document to help propel their accessibility program within their organization and be able to kind of have a defined process in place that will help them, help people coming on, because turnover happens, right? So make sure that if you haven't seen it in your email, the handouts are at bit.ly and then capital HEH for higher education, HEH handouts. And you can download, Chad just posted it in the chat, although he forgot to add the HTTP. He will do that in just a second. You can go there and download both handouts. And of course, they are accessible. So feel free to share those with your teams.
Okay, so let's talk about understanding the tools, guys. I know I briefly discussed this earlier, but we have a lot of tools that we use to generate content, right? And in the context of the discussion we're having here, the tools we use to generate accessible PDF files. We have Microsoft Word. Fundamentally, Microsoft Word does a pretty good job, right? I mean, it really does fail in some areas, but if you're creating basic documents, basic handouts, Word does do a pretty darn good job. PowerPoint as well. I know we didn't really list that in this bulleted list, but PowerPoint actually, I always have to laugh because bulleted lists in PowerPoint are better structured than they are in Word. Same company, have no idea why, but hey, it is what it is.
Except for, Chad, that in a PowerPoint, you can't set anything besides H2. So you have right. H1 for the title slide, H2 for the supplement slides. But beyond that, that's it. That's all you get.
You're right. You're right. So Adobe InDesign, again, fantastic program, very powerful, and really allows you to create a very accessible PDF file pretty much right out of the chute. With some exceptions, but pretty much it does a really good job. Acrobat, I always, whenever I teach Acrobat, I remind people, when you go to the file menu in Acrobat, there's something missing in Acrobat that you have in every other program that you use. And that is new. You cannot create a document in Acrobat. The PDF always comes from somewhere else, right? So Acrobat is really a cleanup tool. Acrobat comes into play on the back end of the process. And it is very powerful and it allows you to do a lot of work. But if you haven't done anything up front, you're going to have your work cut out for you in Adobe Acrobat. And auto tag, by the way, is not the solution. I'm trying to monitor the chat as I'm talking.
I'm doing it, Chad. I got
cool,
you.
cool.
I'm feeding it in.
So WordPress, right? I mean, WordPress, uh, WordPress configured correctly can be very accessible, but you have to be a little careful because WordPress, a lot of times out of the chute, is not very accessible. So there is some back end configuration that is going to be required. Your LMS system, whatever LMS you're using, take a look at the accessibility level. Dax actually just wrote a VPAT for a customer, and that was on an LMS that they were utilizing to present their content. And then, of course, your internal intranets. Again, I mean, there's a lot of variables here. It really depends on how the intranet is built, but those intranets can also be accessible.
Chad,
Right.
I have to say that Michelle Saporito said, "Do you have a book on PDF best practices?" Chad
It's
and
on our
I,
list. It's
we
on our
are
list.
working on a manuscript as we speak. A little secret information for all of you. We are working on a book, and we're trying to work with the publisher to get it out there. And it may end up even being a series of smaller books that talk about very specific topics. We're still batting around the idea of one larger book or a series of smaller books. Matter of fact, in the chat, let me know, would you rather have a volume of books on specific topics or a single book on all of it? That would be great information. All right. So moving on, EDU environments and workflows, right? And so I would say that we talked about this a little bit earlier. We have content comes from everywhere: LMS, IT, email attachments, third-party file servers, Dropbox or Google Docs or hybrid locations. When we're trying to get information out to our students, it would help if I actually advance the slide. If we're trying to get information, I have the preview on the screen in front of me. So I have two different screens, right? So whether it's an LMS or IT, Google Dropbox, email attachments, a third-party server, or some combination thereof, then, you have to get this information out. And sometimes this can be just as much of an issue with accessibility as anything else. So we wanted to talk to you guys today. And this is where we really are looking for some some information and feedback from you on what the workflow for you looks like. I'm going to walk through this, and we're going to be monitoring the chat here. Tell me if there are different variations to this or things that we're missing here that might help us better understand the evolution of a student handout. So it all starts with a lesson plan or an idea. There might be some instructional material that already exists, or maybe you have to develop it. Right? And then you're going to put this together and you're going to assemble it in whatever program it is that you prefer, whether that's PowerPoint or Word or InDesign or Google Docs or wherever it is, right? And then you're going to distribute it. You're going to get this done, and then you're going to send it out to the masses. And whether that's in class or you're going to self-publish it, right? That's handled by you. If you're just handing it out in class, if you're emailing it, you're the one in control of that as well, right? If you have an online link, maybe that's IT or maybe that's self-published, depending upon your environment, right? Or you have an online environment that IT runs, like a Blackboard or other LMS, learning management system, where you kind of upload the content and it's really managed by a different distribution process. And then, of course, what happens? Well, we either get negative or positive feedback or no feedback at all. The barriers are identified, and we have to go back and repeat the assembly process and redistribution process over again. So we'd love to hear from you. What are some of the other ways or struggles that you're finding in this process for getting the information from lesson plan or idea to finished document or digital content that your students are digesting? So Alice says, my content comes from students when they can't read it with text-to-speech software. It's in their course in the LMS. An example is a scanned PDF uploaded to the course. That's something that's not in here, right? So when we're assembling our documents, the source is really important. And when you get scanned content, if you don't have enough awareness in your staff for them to know, hey, this scanned content is really just like having a JPEG of a car versus, the 800 words of text that it is, then you can, already just from the get-go, you're creating more barriers than you're solving. Right. So that's about awareness. And Carolyn says, at a more organizational level, our struggle is we often find the information after it's published, and then we have to talk about accessibility. It's really a reactive process. So Carolyn, if you could maybe comment some more about that. When you are the lines were changing. My brain wasn't following along. So when you're publishing this content and then you have to make changes to it, or are you just identifying that, hey, someone in our organization published this content out there somewhere, and now we've got to go back and redo it? Chad, why don't you read some of these other ones?
Sorry, I was following the chat and I was trying to make sure we're responding.
Right. So Amy said, why don't you read Amy's comment? We'll go from there.
It doesn't check for everything, but it is incredibly useful for our instructors who are learning about accessibility. So I'm assuming she's talking about.
Well, her comment previously was about Blackboard. We have D2L and Blackboard Ally, which is really helpful because it runs an accessibility checker on all the documents. So yes, right. So Chad, I mean, definitely we see this all the time where a checker can run an accessibility check, but what happens to the document?
Yeah, I got a document the other day that somebody wanted me to remediate or make sure it was compliant. I ran it through the pack checker and it passed 100%.
Right.
But when I opened up the tag structure, I was like, oh my gosh, like this is all wrong. And that's where, Dax had mentioned earlier how we always say accessibility is a series of automated and manual checks. And there is a period of, there are situations where you get false positives, or is that right? False positive, false negative,
or even
whatever.
False negatives for like color contrast with the new pack checker, right?
Yep. So, it really does, at that level, it takes somebody who's knowledgeable, somebody who understands the tag structure to be able to look at this and be like, wait a second, I have an entire page tagged as a paragraph.
Right.
That is not okay. Right. That does not work. And it violates info and relationships because things are not tagged appropriately in the document.
Well, Andrea says, flipbooks are all the rage right now, very inaccessible. And I agree with you. We were at CSUN though. And I will tell you, there is an organization, and I don't remember the name of it, but that was promoting their flipbook service that allows you to have the interactive flipbook with an accessible fallback. And I thought, oh, this is really great. I can just create a flipbook and then press a button and I'll get the accessible content. Nope. What they were doing was taking the flipbook, publishing it like normal, and then they were doing all the extraction and back-end work to create all the HTML fallbacks and all the pop-ups. And I'm like, wow, this is great if I want to hand this off to you. But if I've got to get this out and I'm looking for a quick way to get this information online, I can't wait a week for you to get this back to me. I mean, that's just not the reality, right?
Well, Dax, I had a client ask me to evaluate a flipbook site, and it was not accessible at all. However, they offered the ability to download an accessible PDF.
Sure. I think that's definitely the good thing.
So that's providing an acceptable alternative, correct?
Right. And then Shannon Ryan says, will they ever develop a pack checker for Mac? They are developing it. The hard part is it's so much harder to get things to work in the Mac, in the Apple environment with the Apple SDK, and then get it to market than it is for Windows environment. So I would love to say it's coming soon, but
we've been saying that for a year.
Yeah. And so I don't want to, So Kate says, what's a flipbook? Flipbooks basically are a visual presentation of basically like you were turning pages in a book, and they allow for pop-ups and video content and hyperlinks and all sorts of stuff. And, you know, they're great visually, but they're terrible for accessibility experiences.
They often have that visual flipping of the page
Right.
as you're turning the page, which I don't know. I don't understand the allure of that. I mean, if I'm reading a document, that doesn't really add much to my experience, but you know, that's just me. Um, yeah, publish online from InDesign, Lucas, is not accessible at all because it pretty much like wraps every character in a span. So yeah, unfortunately, I wish that was more accessible as well. Um,
Awesome. Chad?
cool, cool. All right, so how are changes handled? Right down the rabbit hole. How are changes handled in your organization? Well, a lot of people, you know, I do them myself, right? So, you know, you're the document author, you make the changes, and you know that's your workflow. Some people have staff do them, and then you review it. So again, you know, whenever you involve more people in the process, right? I mean, it can be beneficial, but it can also be detrimental because if everyone's not on the same page, you know, you may not get, you know, the same quality that you're looking for. And other, so do you have the time? What is the turnaround? Okay.
There you
Sorry, you're
go.
like,
Go ahead. No,
uh, uh,
we have a lag. Go ahead.
um, do you have the time? What is the turnaround? Is it minutes? Is it days? Is it weeks? You know, and a lot of this is going to depend on the complexity of the document, right? Um, you know, I mean, my wife is a teacher, right? So I see the documents that she is creating, and typically they're 1 to 2 pages, right? So, you know, we're typically not in the days to weeks category here, but certainly, you know, if you have to make changes to those documents, you know, there is a level of effort, you know, involved. How do we solve this problem? All right. So again, I mentioned this earlier. One of the most important things you can do is use the tools the way they were intended to be used, right? Word has bulleted lists. InDesign has bulleted lists, you know, use the feature, right? Word has styles. Those styles are going to map to tags. Use styles in your document. So, you know, again, oftentimes when I'm teaching a class, I'll say, how many people have actually had training on Microsoft Word? And I would say the percentage is in like 5%, right? If we look back to our career, we showed up to work one day and there was a computer sitting there and they said, figure it out, right? You know, and somebody put Word in front of us and said, start typing, you know. So, you know, there is some training involved, but you know, the more you know, the better result you're going to get on the back end. We have checklists for basic document creation. As a matter of fact, one of which you got today, right? That is the Word. Am I right, Dax? Was that the Word checklist? Yeah.
Yeah.
So leverage that. That walks you through all the things you need to do in Word to make a good document.
Hey, Chad, for 1 second. So
Yeah,
Kate asks, if given the choice between Access PDF and Access Word, which would you go with?
it depends, Kate, right? So if I'm starting with a Word document, I want Access Word. Absolutely 100%, I want Access Word. If I'm starting with another type of document for, you know, so for example, PowerPoint, even Adobe InDesign, I'm reaching for Access PDF, right? So they both are incredibly powerful and they both have a place in my workflow, right? But if my source document is Word, Access Word's really all I need. I never even have to open it in Access PDF because it's going to spit out a fully compliant document. But if I'm starting anywhere but in Word, Access PDF is a really, really huge benefit. I've even started leveraging Access PDF quite a bit in my InDesign documents because, as you know, InDesign will create a section tag for every single text frame in your document. And Access PDF now gives you the ability to, what do we call that?
Level up.
Dax? Level up.
Yeah, level up
Yeah.
a tag. So if it's
So,
got a section, yeah, go ahead, Chad.
yeah, so you can like click on a section tag and say, delete the section tag and slide all the other tags up to take its place. It's awesome. I mean, I use it on every document I do. I mean, it's really, really nice.
So
Yeah,
Carolyn had another, she said, how does it compare with Common Look Word? And I will tell you, Common Look Word, you kind of have to batch process. Access Word, literally you use styles, set up some things within your document. You're inside the document, you click on a table, you say, okay, this is a layout table. It removes all the table structure on export. It automatically removes all your paragraph, your extra paragraph returns, all of that stuff without you having to go out and batch process the document before you actually get to the accessible PDF. You literally do everything inside Word. And when you hit save to access PDF, it's compliant.
Awesome. Save to access Word or export
access
PDF. You mean? Yeah.
Save to PDF using access.
Yeah.
Word, right.
Yep.
Yeah. Awesome. So easily. So we just talked about kind of this access Word integration. Chad, number 4.
Accessibility, awareness, empathy. Right. So, actually, Dax and I, we recorded a podcast before we did this webinar. I know the work is never done, but we had a guest on where he implemented accessibility in his organization, and it's a really great interview. Check it out next week if you want to. But half the battle is making everyone in your team, in your organization, aware of accessibility and aware of the importance of accessibility. And that can have a big impact. Like when everybody's on board, when everybody's aware of the effort, it makes a huge, huge difference. And then number 5, as Dax and I mentioned before, start small. Get the basic wins first, and then the other wins are going to come eventually, right? But if you start with basic, simple improvements, they can have big impacts on the accessibility of your document.
All right. So we had a podcast. If you're not listening to our podcast, you really should be. This was a guest that we had on. His name was Jeremy Sita, and he's from North Idaho College. And he had a great analogy for small wins. So there's transcript on screen and the audio. So let's take a listen.
I also teach Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I like to give this analogy because, well, anybody can identify with this. And when you're in a bad position in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, if you try to make that situation 100% better, you're going to fail every time. So I like to think of it of, if you can make your situation 1% better, do you think maybe you'll see how to make it 2% better? And if you can make it 2% better, do you think you'll see how to make it 5% better? And then just eventually you'll be able to work your way out. But so that initial 1% is just so crucial. And so kind of a saying that people remind me of all the time is, hey, just make it 1% better.
Join Chad Chilius and me, Dax Castro, where each week we...
All right, we don't need to listen to the end, the extra, but really it is about that 1%. If you can just get them moving in the right direction. I had a person who said, I don't do accessibility for InDesign. It's just too hard. I said, great, not a problem. Hey, can you right click on that object and go to object export options and see this spot right here? Let me just show you how to add alt text. And she's like, oh, that was pretty easy. I can do that. And it just started there. And now that person is really an accessibility advocate because they've realized that it is that small thing and very simple things that can lead to much more accessibility, right? Nick asked, what are some approaches to creating a culture of awareness on campus, engaging both faculty and staff administration? I think the biggest thing, Nick, is awareness. If people are aware of how an inaccessible document is read, what kind of barriers it presents to the general public who need it, they automatically go, wow, that's terrible. Who could understand that, right? And it starts to be able to open that question. There's a plugin called Funkify for your browser that does things like make your cursor have tremors, show you what low vision looks like by making things slightly blurrier. Chad and I do an accessibility awareness empathy lab. So if you're interested in that, let us know. And we do that digitally over the web. So it's pretty low key, but it's very effective. It is about having them understand, right? Screen reader demos, exactly. The plugin is called Funkify, Funkify.
I think it's FUNKIFY,
right?
yeah.
Right. So definitely those are some great ways. And getting empathy from top down is always the best approach in getting buy-in for your organization. When you can get your faculty and administrative staff on board with creating a culture of accessibility, Funkify works just on the web browser, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you just answered Nick's question, because I wanted to, but I think Nick said thank you. So I think you did answer his question, because
right.
That's exactly what I was going to say, Dax, is that, he's like, what techniques, can use to get people on board, and an empathy lab is a great way to do it. Another thing I want to bring up, and I can't remember who it was. I think it was somebody we had on the podcast, Dax, who said they had a meeting, but a bigger meeting, like in an auditorium. And the first 10 minutes, somebody came out and signed to everyone for 10 minutes. And then somebody came out and said, "How did you enjoy our presentation?" And I was like, wow, like what a way to make people aware of, you know what I mean? Because they reversed it, right? They totally reversed the problem, and they're now, making people aware of oh, wow, there are people who need assistance, to consume content.
Well, Chad, I think it's about it. So many people don't understand what it's like to be in a marginalized portion of society, right? When you are the minority, when you are the person who's not getting that information, when you are the person that struggles, all of a sudden perspectives start to change, right? Shannon asked, what's the best screen reader to use to check our documents with? Now, Chad, you and I mean, you're going to check it with Apple VoiceOver being on a Mac, right? But we also know that JAWS and NVDA are the accepted standards. If people have a cognitive disability, they're going to be using probably text help, read and write, right? Which is more of a visual text-to-speech reader versus something like NVDA or JAWS, which is primarily for kind of blind or mobility based barriers. And so really the idea is that you should understand how each operate and what the nuances are for each of them. I know that a table is voiced differently inside JAWS versus NVDA. So if I've got a funky table, I might just listen to the table in both screen readers. It doesn't mean that I'm going to test my entire document in JAWS and NVDA. I just might be spot checking in certain places.
Maria had a good one. She said she started an online presentation with a video that didn't have audio. That's another great way to do that, right? Like
absolutely
just play a TV show or something with no audio and say, "How did you enjoy that?"
Yeah,
that was good, right?
Nope, absolutely.
But then also, Amy brought up a really good topic that you and I have talked about, Dax. She uses read and write, and Equatio. So one thing to remember, and Dax, we discovered this: read and write is not a screen reader.
Right. It is a text-to-speech tool. So it requires, it relies on your mouse, or it also relies on the read order in your PDFs. It doesn't use the tag order. So if you're going to listen to something in NVDA, you might get a different experience than listening to it in read and write, especially if you have not set the reading order. And that's a whole nother topic of reading order versus tag order.
Let's not go there.
But the idea is that you need to understand your audience, right? And Apple OS is inconsistent across mobile devices. Absolutely, all screen readers, Apple VoiceOver, Android TalkBack, Windows Narrator, all of them have different experiences, whether you're on mobile or desktop. It really just is the nature of what digital content is. And if I'm going to be distributing a PDF that is my courseware, it's not likely that my users are going to be using their phone to read that content, but I'm going to ask the questions. If I've got a person with a disability, the best way to know is to ask and say, hey, how are you going to be digesting this PDF? Do you just use your phone because basically it's a voice, you're just more comfortable? Or are you going to be using it on a PC or a Mac? And being able to understand the environment which they're going to be reading that information is really key, right?
And Mo had a point. He was saying Apple iOS is inconsistent across mobile devices versus desktop. I would agree, Mo, although I have found that VoiceOver on iOS devices is pretty darn good. I can navigate the headings on an iOS device. I can read the content. It does a pretty good job. I've been having a harder time with VoiceOver on a desktop. I'm still working on that. But I am having some challenges with that as well. And Michael brought up a point about the NFL game where the New York and Buffalo, I'm assuming he means the Jets and Buffalo, where one team was green and one was red.
Right.
That's really a great example as well.
Well, we are over time, guys. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you so much. And if you need help beyond the webinar that you just told, that we just had, reach out to us. accessibilityunraveled.com. Find us on LinkedIn, join our Facebook group, go listen to the podcast. We're here for you. We understand the struggles that you're going through. And we have solutions, whether it's workflow or best practices manuals or checklists. We have you. And yes, we are going to be at Accessing Higher Ground. Chad and I are going to be teaching a one-day pre-conference webinar on document accessibility testing with a screen reader. So I am going to share the contact slide here for us. Let me get back to that screen. Where did Chad, you want to share screen? I don't see my thing anymore.
Was it bit.ly?
So they were looking for the
sorry, what are they looking for? Contact slide?
Yeah, so I can't share my screen anymore.
Okay, let me try to share mine.
And thank you guys so much for being part of this webinar. Feel free again to reach out and it's up here. There we go. Hit that. Awesome.
Can you guys see that?
Yep, it's resolving now. So awesome. And then I'll be speaking at Amplify for the AEC community. Anyway, thank you guys so much. This recording will be available. We appreciate your time, and the rest of you guys have a great rest of the day.
Yeah, thanks everyone.